Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to JWA's inaugural film club. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am so happy to be back with you tonight after a little break for the first session of our new series. Please say hello in the chat box. We'd love to know who's with us. Make sure to chat to everyone. That's also where you can add questions throughout our conversation tonight. We are really delighted to be able to continue gathering together from all around the world for conversation and learning. And after nearly 3 years of our virtual programs, we're really excited to mix it up with this new format of the Film Club. We came up with this idea pretty much out of our course on Jewish women in film and TV that we did last June, when we felt like there was just so much energy for going deeper into particular films. And so we'll get to do that tonight. So glad that you're with us. Also, just on a logistical note, want to say that if you would like closed captioning, you can click the CC button on the bottom where it says show captions, and that should hopefully work for you. Very happy to see people's names pouring in. Before we begin our conversation, I also just want to say a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories, broadly defined. We offer many opportunities to bring the lenses of history and gender to the pressing issues of this moment. The virtual programs are one aspect of JWA's work. Please go to jwa.org to delve into all of the kinds of projects and resources that we have to offer. Hopefully you will find lots to dig into and engage with there. Tonight, we are very lucky to have with us Dr. Sasha T. Goldberg, a professor, researcher, author, and oral historian who holds a PhD in gender studies from Indiana University and a master's degree in Judaism from the Graduate Theological Union. Dr. Goldberg currently teaches women's and gender studies at City College of San Francisco and consults across a broad spectrum on diversity and inclusion. In her previous life, she ran LGBT and Jewish nonprofits, delivered kosher meals to homebound seniors, and was a landscaper. Her scholarship, therefore, is interdisciplinary by design, intersectional by dedication, and fueled by the pursuit of access, justice, and equity, which sounds right up our alley here at JWA. She lives in Oakland, California with her wife, Lynn, and their favorite four-pod troublemaker, Phineas. And we are so glad to have you with us tonight, Dr. Goldberg. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me back. Being at JWA always feels like a really good hometown crowd. And it's so lovely to see so many names in the chat, folks that I know, folks that I don't yet know. Super excited to get to know you all, and fresh from a viewing of Yentl last night. I'm gonna share my screen and we will get started.
And while you start that, I'm gonna suggest that maybe as we begin, people can put into the chat any memories that they want to share of the first time they saw Yentl. And if you haven't seen it in a while and you watched it again for our conversation tonight, if you had anything that you was surprising watching it again in 2023.
Yeah, perfect prompts. If I could have planted you, I would. These are the sorts of retrospective things I want us to be thinking about. So I've titled this talk / discussion, MAPA, Can You Hear Me? Screening Jews, Gender, and Yentl at 40. So a little transparent reference in there, and marking also 40 years of Yentl with this great piece of art by Deborah Cast. And so looking back on how we received the film, how the world received the film, and how we relate to it today will be the heart of what we are transversing together. Give me just one moment here. Okay. So just a little film theory for you today, remembering Laura Mulvey's The Gaze. And this was written in 1975. So right before Yentl comes out, Laura Mulvey develops this theory about the gaze, that the male gaze is set on this stance where woman stands in patriarchal culture as a signifier for the male other, not, in other words, for herself, but bound by a symbolic order in which man, singular, and men can live out fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command by imposing them on the silent image of a woman, still tied to her place as the bearer of meaning and not the maker of meaning. And when I was rewatching Yentl and thinking back on Yentl, of course, I think it's very easy to understand why a woman in 1904 Eastern Europe is striving for manhood, malehood, passing as a man, learning as a man, when really we see so clearly she is the bearer of meaning and not the maker of meaning. That's Phineas now, I apologize. And in that setup, we have also the very clear example of Hadass as the doting and dutiful bride to be, who is mostly silent and asking about preferences. So as we come into this cultural moment of viewing in 1983, we've got Mulvey right behind us. So how was the movie received at the time? I'm starting with a low-hanging branch, reliable Roger Ebert, and he extrapolates to say that Yentl is Barbra Streisand's dream movie. And she'd been trying to make it for 10 years. She herself bought the rights to Isaac Bashevis's Singer's Story, and Hollywood told her she was crazy, as they've told women for all kinds of reasons and all kinds of contexts. But Ebert says Hollywood was right on the irrefutable, logical ground that a woman in her 40s can hardly be expected to be convincing as a 17-year-old boy, and that through Streisand, nevertheless, she persisted. She worked on the movie for 4 years, producing, directing, co-writing, and also starring. So in other words, nevertheless, she persisted, and she had to do it all herself when she wanted the story to be told, which so many of us have and still relate to in our own lives. There was also speculation that Hollywood would find Yentl too Jewish for middle American audiences. And he argues that that's not true, kind of universalizing Yentl by saying at one time or another, almost everyone has wanted to do something and be something they couldn't, and almost everyone has loved the wrong person for the right reason. And so he takes a very, very culturally specific story and stretches it in a way that absolutely is relatable. But in doing so, he also takes away quite a bit of the Jewish content and frankly, quite a bit of the gender content. So those are the two things I'd like to focus on today, the Jewish question and the gender content and how those things line up, intersect, refuse each other, invite each other in the conversation, and of course, where we all stand as viewers. And in thinking about all these years of Jewish history, and in particular the past 40 years, this quote about Jewish history turning out not to be an either-or story, as in either this pure Judaism, right, that's detached from its surroundings, or else on the other end, assimilation. And we can think about the end of Fiddler on the Roof for that in some ways, but rather for the vast majority, the adventure of living in between. And then there's America. And so thinking about American media in 1982, and particularly Jewish and non-Jewish media in America in 1982, we have what is envisioned as the universal Christmas story, as the American story. And then in Jewish selections, interestingly, we have another cross-dressing story. Dustin Hoffman is Tootsie, so there's got to be something in the water. And then Sophie's Choice. So if we are not prepared to Jewish cross-dress and gender delve that year, we're in the Holocaust. So tonight we're going to stay with cross-dressing and frankly, a much more fun time. And in the span of 40 years, cinema has changed and Jews and gender have changed. I would add Jewish gender has changed. And then the lens with which we view media has changed and we ourselves have changed. So just two theories that I want to keep here for us. One is gender performativity. And what we've been working with, wrangling, learning, wrestling, believing, and disbelieving is if gender is socially constructed, right? If it gets designed upon us and we design ourselves in its image, then it's not so much innate. And so in figuring out these traits aren't written on the body, then how do we make them? And how does Yentl become Anshel? And so I bring up gender performativity from Judith Butler because she theorizes it as a repetition of acts, doing something over and over and over again, which obviously we know so much about in Judaism, both from prayer, memory, religious observance, repetition, and that repetition of acts carves that path. And then we construct our identity. On top of those acts, who and how are we in the world? This is then a performative accomplishment. We are seen as we aim or wish to be seen. And finally, in terms of this idea about normativities, Butler argues that we're compelled by social sanction and reward. So a very easy example of this is when we look at Yentl turning to Ancho. Yentl is a woman yearning. She's yearning for education. She's yearning for love. She's yearning for her father to keep living. She's yearning for a different world. And it's completely impossible to her unless she performs the Jewish male gender. And it wouldn't work if she performed non-Jewish male gender. And it doesn't work when she performs female Jewish gender. And so this social sanction and reward that she gets, as we very quickly see, is she gets to read Torah and she gets to discuss ideas and she gets to be a part of life. So Judith Butler leaves us with the idea that we act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. And Anchal certainly consolidates that. And as we get further along, there's also this idea of the Bechdel test. Alison Bechdel wrote a very long-running comic strip called Dykes to Watch Out For. And in it, two women are walking and talking about the movies. And one says to the other, you know, I only see movies if there's at least two female characters and they talk to each other and they talk to each other about something other than a man. And the other one says, well, you must hardly ever go to the movies. And in 1985, this was true. And it can still be true now. And if it gets in your brain and you start charting it, you'll start noticing how really rare it is in many movies for there to be more than, you know, two incidental female characters who talk to each other, again, about something other than a man. And we see this so clearly in Yentl. The entire female universe revolves around cooking, cleaning, hawking the wares, setting the table, pouring the tea just right. Do you want lemon or do you want milk? All of it from morning till night. And so Yentl has no chance as an autonomous person or as a character of passing this Bechdel test. And in the 40 years since, Yentl and Anchal have been seen and imagined and theorized as any number of things. And if you feel like you'd like to put some in the chat, that would be good too, to come back to and return to. Yentl with Hadass has been theorized as lesbian love and desire on the screen, with Sweet Mandy Patinkin as this, you know, heterosexual longing. There's also been theoretical homosexual longing between, I just keep thinking Mandy Patinkin. I can't actually reverse. I just keep seeing his naked body in the water, which maybe you are too. But there's all of this. Thank you, Avigdor. Thank you so much. All of this really, these tense moments that are filled with longing between them as Avigdor and Anchal, which is straight up homoeroticism that whether or not it was written into the film, that's how it reads to many people. So these 4 decades have introduced all of these other ideas, and also the idea and the question, is Anchal a trans Jewish character? Just a little background, and we'll be sending these links later, but Peshet gives a very great list created by 3 rabbis of the terms that have been used historically in Judaism for these in-between places and these spaces of and. And so there's many, many, many examples. We don't quite have time today to go through all of them, but all to say, we have this tradition both textually and, of course, from embodiment and living in Judaism. So I want to suggest that any reading you may have had, and I'm going to stretch out the timeline, I'm going to say any reading you may have had 40 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or last night, as many of us were refreshing, that any of these readings are good readings, that there is no wrong reading, and that I invite you to play with them. And I'm referencing the word queer here, not in terms of sexuality, although that read too is valid, but queer as in outside the narrow binary, outside the narrow definitions about Judaism, about gender, about Torah, about Yentl and Anshel. And I want to share Alexander Doty's read, who insists that queer readings aren't actually alternative readings, that they're not wishful or willful misreadings, or even this idea that we're reading too much into things. We're just looking for it. It's not there. It's just us. He really centers us, the readers, the viewers, the speakers, the observers, in the position to say, actually, they result from the recognition and articulation of the complex range of queerness that has been in popular culture texts and their audiences all along. In other words, if you see it, it's there. And you can tell them that a nice Jewish doctor told you so. So as we start to gear up for this undoubtedly very rich discussion, some of the prompts are, when did you first see Yentl? And then how did you personally either feel, theorize, or experience her character? In other words, what did you think about it while you were watching? What did you feel about it while you were watching? What did you think later? Is this your first time considering these additional interpretations? And how do you feel or theorize or experience Yentl and Anshel, and also Agvidor now? And a central question for gender studies and feminist studies would be, are there things that are gained or lost or traded in these modern interpretations? And if we can break that down, I would like us to think about what's gained, lost, or traded Jewishly in these modern interpretations, what's gained, lost, or traded gender-wise, and then I want to invite you to think otherwise. What else comes up for you when you look at it today? And looking at it today could mean just looking back through memory, which to me is one of the most interesting things about memory. Are you remembering it the way you saw it? And so some of these lost, traded, gained questions are, what's gained, lost, and traded when we translate an original text from Yiddish to English? What's gained, lost, and traded when we take a story and we put it on film? And what's gained, lost, and traded when we take a story about a woman passing as a boy to gain access both to Torah and inevitably to life itself, and we take that story and say, move her identity, or add to her identity, or shift her identity? What happens to Yentl? What happens to Anshel? And what happens to the other characters in that story? We have to talk about the love triangle. What about that love triangle? If that is not one of the queerest things you've seen on screen, I don't know what. It's one of the queerest things I've seen on screen. And finally, what do we think the promises are that Leaving for America holds for Yentl? Beyond becoming, Lowenstein and therapy, the inevitable, intellectual pursuits. For she herself, what does it mean that she literally has to leave the land that she loves in search of a new life? And that she does so, by the way, as Yentl and not as Anshel. So those are the things that I'm thinking about in watching this. These are the things that I would like you all to be thinking about, plus whatever other amazing thoughts you're already having. And to you, Judith.
Thank you so much. That was a great starting place. Wow. And there's it's so rich. There's so much to talk about here. And maybe we should begin by talking a little bit about some of the differences between the story and the film, because I think it gets at some of that richness of both how we read it and and what is traded and lost in different kind of depictions of the story or interpretations of the story. And I think it's also important to say that Singer did not like this movie and had some strong words about it, which I can share some of them a little bit. And that's, I think, probably not at all unusual when someone's work is transposed into a different medium. It can be, I'm sure, a little bit off-putting. But part of what's really interesting, I mean, there's so many things that are interesting about sort of how this story developed, right? Even just from the fact that Singer wrote this story in Yiddish, but it's actually published originally in English in the early 1960s. And Barbra Streisand actually optioned it in like 1968 or 69. So it took her a very long time to get it onto screen for a lot of reasons, as you mentioned, including, you know, people not believing that she would be able to pull it off. And I think she identified probably very much with Yentl in people not kind of having the confidence that she could be a director and do this. And also that this story might be too Jewish in a lot of ways. I know we have a question about the Broadway show and how it differs from the movie. I actually am not as familiar with the Broadway show. So I hope someone else can answer that question. I don't know, Sasha, if you know much about the show.
You know, I have not seen the show. I certainly would love to. And I also haven't seen the 2012 rendition where Yentl is theorized and produced as a trans figure. So I can't speak to either production in terms of in person. And I wonder if folks in the chat are able to. How well-versed are we as a group with Yentl on the stage?
Yes, if anyone can share on that, that would be great. One of the things that's really interesting in comparing the story and the film, and I will say also, I did not read the story in Yiddish. I read it in translation. My Yiddish is not good enough to read a story. But the story in a lot of ways feels more queer or more explicitly queer in a lot of ways, in part because there's repeated descriptions of Anshul or Yentl as not being male or female. She says that about herself. Her father says that she has the soul of a man. You know, she says, I'm neither one nor the other. And so there's really a sense of kind of questioning the binary there that in the film, at least in my reading of it, and again, I know there can be lots of different ways to read this, it feels that Streisand is playing a character who is a woman who is playing a man, but that she herself seems to believe herself to be a woman who does not identify with the other women at all. There's in some ways, it feels to me at least like there's a fair amount of, and this is in the story too, kind of internalized misogyny there, sort of like dismissiveness about what women do and what they're involved in and what their conversations are like, and a longing for that male world of rigorous study that does not have to worry about cooking the meal and darning the socks. In the story also, there are different uses of pronouns, and I know from my colleague Sarah that is also different in the Yiddish version versus the translation, where it's even more, you know, in the translation, Anshul is often using she, her pronouns, is described as she, her pronouns, which is kind of interesting. But Singer also seems to present the gender confusion there as unnatural, right? Like it's a problem. Whereas Streisand really treats it kind of with empathy, right? There's sort of this sense that like we really are meant to identify with Yentl and to, you know, to look on her situation with empathy and with understanding. One of the other really big differences in the film version versus the story is that in the story, Anshul and Hadass consummate their marriage. And that does not happen in the film. And there are many ways to interpret that. It definitely keeps the film less explicit to avoid the question of sex. It also adds a little bit of sort of slapstick of Anshul kind of running away from Hadass. And then, of course, there's the really big difference of the ending, which you reference of like, what does it mean that Yentl goes to America and goes to America as a woman, as opposed to in the story where Yentl chooses to stay as Anshul and just to become a wandering Jew who goes presumably from town, on to the next yeshiva as Anshul and to continue to live that life. And that was one of the things that like particularly pissed off Singer about the ending. And just to share, I have a few of his words here that I want to share because it was actually, I thought, very funny. He says, let's imagine a scriptwriter who decides that Madame Bovary should end up taking a cruise along the Riviera, or that Anna Karenina should marry an American millionaire instead of committing suicide, and Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov should become a Wall Street broker instead of going to Siberia. This is what Miss Streisand did by making Yentl, whose greatest passion was the Torah, go on a ship to America, singing at the top of her lungs. Why would she decide to go to America? Weren't there enough yeshivas in Poland or in Lithuania where she could continue to study? Was going to America Miss Streisand's idea of a happy ending for Yentl? What would Yentl have done in America? Worked in a sweatshop 12 hours a day when there is no time for learning? Would she try to marry a salesman in New York, move to the Bronx or Brooklyn, and rent an apartment with an icebox and a dumbwaiter? This kitsch ending summarized all the faults of the adaptation. And so he kind of goes on about that. But I think we see there this kind of, on the one hand, some of his critique is kind of funny, like he's comparing himself to Moliere and, Dostoevsky and okay. But he has a point. There isn't an easy, it's not obvious that certainly a woman who emigrated to the States in the early 20th century was not going to study in a yeshiva. She might have been able to take some courses uptown at the Jewish Theological Seminary as long as she promised she wasn't going to try to study to be a rabbi, as Henrietta Zold had to do. But more likely she would have, as he said, worked in a sweatshop. And there wasn't, this is a rosy view of history. But we can also see a kind of old world versus new world approach, and Streisand's real optimism about what the American Jewish experience would hold and the kind of individualism and experimentation there. So I think it's very interesting to kind of compare those two things and to see how maybe there's like a playing out of what it means to be an American Jew and the kind of experimentation that might enable, or the kind of freedom that people, individualism that people bring to that Streisand is trying to put there.
That's a great summation and amazing questions, because what, you've given like a view at 1,000 feet and also the view at 50 feet, and that tension of like how he himself saw the film and how people who have read it in Yiddish versus in English versus saw the film versus saw the play, if we consolidate the image, right, what are we left with? And it is, in fact, a bit blurry. And people are very invested in an answer to that in some ways, right? Yentl means something different to each one of us. And that's true too. The one thing I'll add onto what you've said, just to complicate it even more, add another layer, is that language of, specifically, it's a quote, the female soul, the male soul heaving in the female bosom. That language was assigned specifically to female folks denoted as introverts in the 1900s. And so Singer would have known that, right? And so that's also coded language there, not for men or trans figures, but for same-sex desiring, but also male dressing female people. But we don't see that medicalization in it, we only see Avigdor's large, I would say it's the one place we see a real toxic masculinity in his large response when she's unveiling herself, I should say revealing or choosing to disclose. I don't need to get all bridal about it, but his visceral anger, he is threatened by it. And then, you know, we see him very quickly switch channels to the heteronormative, oh, I knew I always desired you for some reason, right?
Right.
And
And,
that's, yeah.
right. And his own homophobia of being like, it turns out he admits I was
Right.
scared that I was what, you know, now I know there wasn't anything wrong with me, that I wanted to touch you or that I had feelings for you.
Right.
I actually wondered watching that scene, I was trying to think of an earlier movie where we see, or maybe it's not that scene, it's the earlier scene where she's getting dressed. I was trying to think of an earlier scene in a movie where you see a woman binding her breasts, or you see someone with a bound chest. I couldn't think of
similar time frame, but much later film would be Albert Nobbs.
Mhm.
So English service culture. There's a really mind-blowing, heart-shattering in all the best ways scene in that movie where the main figure, Albert Nobbs, finds another butch woman living as a man, but only because that woman undoes her shirt to show Albert Nobbs. And that scene of recognition in a similar time period. But I would be hard pressed to think of another film either before it or of the same time period, regardless of when it's shot. If anyone else can think of that, I would like give you a Jeopardy prize or something.
Right. It was
Yeah.
kind of an interesting question. And in that scene also, just like the disappointment of Avigdor not being able to imagine, you know, Avigdor is sort of, for most of the film, is sort of presented as the intellectual giant, but actually is very limited in what he's in his imagination of what it could be to be in a relationship with Anshul / Yentl, right? You know, that,
Right.
oh, well,
Right.
you could be my wife and then you wouldn't study, but maybe you could study in secret at night, right? And I think that kind of brings up one of the interesting questions. I mean, so much of this movie is about categories, right? And sort of how do we understand a crisis of categories? Which categories hold, which categories should hold, which categories should be transgressed. And it's also a movie where the study is all about Jewish law. And so much of what Yentl is trying to do is like, you know, she's constantly asking, where is this written? Like, why is this the rule? And there's a lot to say about the oversimplification of Judaism itself, right? You know, we see study as what Judaism is. We don't see much in the way of ritual. There's a kind of oversimplification that, you know, it's Hollywood. They're not going to make it quite as complex as reality, perhaps. But it's that scene is also about this whole question of like, well, how do we release Hadass from this marriage without leaving her chained, right? Without leaving her as an aguna? Like, how could we dissolve this marriage within the context of halacha, which of course is sort of absurd because there are already so many violations here that are not according to halacha, that like, why should the idea that you have to find the answer within Jewish law? But of course, that also is very much part of how modern Judaism operates, right? People choose the rules that they must stay within, and then figure out the exceptions to that, and then try to work sometimes within a Jewish legal framework to solve the thing that they've already put themselves outside of the legal framework for. So it's this very interesting question about like which systems hold and which systems do they want to have hold, and which can you imagine yourself out of? And I found that kind of fascinating and very much like a reflection on American Judaism in the 20th, 21st centuries.
Agree. And also the notion of, you know, God will understand, but I'm not so sure about the neighbors, right? There's this view throughout of God as both omnipresent and gentle and kind, and also understanding and forgiving, which are historically traits only socialized onto female figures. And so that's bent as well. versus, the punitive God, the God of rage, the God of retribution. And part of what also struck me in all of it was this idea of, okay, we'll still study at night. You can study at night. We can draw the shades and do this very closeted thing. And then you look at American Jews, hiding, and European Jews, obviously hiding behind the curtains and Shabbat in the basement and all of these things that were to come when, in this movie, it's all about like, no, you can't even access the text.
Right.
You're supposed to live by it, but you can't access it.
Right. And we should say that that is another one of the critiques about the world that is portrayed in the film, is that we don't see any, except for the one scene where Yentl tries to get on the carriage and the peasants drive off after taking her money. We don't see any non-Jews. We don't see any anti-Semitism. This is supposed to take place in 1904, which is a year after the Kishinev pogrom. So, there's no explanation for why the boat full of people leaving Eastern Europe is going to America in the first place. And that's kind of interesting too. Again, I think some of that hiding is transposed onto other issues, and it's a kind of a closed circuit.
Mm-hmm. It is that we see it as Jewish viewers as an insider view, but it's also a world that unless you were raised from an Orthodox and unless you are familiar with all of these sex segregations, the layers to which you've had access shift. So if we're watching it as secular Jews now, we see an entirely different kind of take politically, emotionally, intellectually, and otherwise than 40 years ago, to some extent. And yet I can imagine viewers now who might just be looking for an interesting Jewish gender thing, far more leaning towards a transparent, far more leaning towards something totally secular, totally modern, related to the now, devoid of religion in many contexts. Because it is this world that, you're right, of course, totally exists unto itself. And the only vision we have of that wagon, it's like, yeah, you're the Jewish boy that's going to get beat up the minute you step foot in America, because of what America demands in terms of assimilation and male Jewish gender and masculinity. And so is that a foreshadowing? Is that why Yentl has to be Yentl and not Anshel when she's on the boat? Like, don't know.
Right. Though she seems fairly comfortable as Yentl on the boat, which and that is a big shift from the story itself.
Mm-hmm. And even when she says to Avigdor at the very end, they embrace and he touches her beardless face again and, calls her Anshel, she corrects him and says Yentl. So right. That their parting is, remember me as Yentl. And that whole thing about like the brother relationships, right, where she has lost her brother and taken his name, and Anshel then leads into this life with Avigdor, and Avigdor keeps wanting to make him his little brother, but also maybe wants to have sex with him, but also maybe wants to have sex with her. It does get very, very post moment in that way.
Right. And he wants Anshel to talk about Hadass also. There's a kind of triangulation there. Like, I can be it's okay for me to be aroused around you if we're talking about Hadass, right? Like, there's a way of using that relationship as a way to cover for the homoeroticism.
Right. Let's watch the movie together.
Right. And I think it's interesting. I mean, it makes sense also for Singer's version to, in some ways, have a more explicit queer narrative, paradoxically, in some ways, because he is closer to that homosocial world of the yeshiva, where there was clear, it was not spoken about, but there clearly was within that homosocial world also homoeroticism that was very much a part of it, and people knew that. And Streisand is farther from that and needs to put it into a kind of different context. I think can't play that up as much as a kind of given, perhaps.
and her own experience with homosocial universes would have been all female and quite different,
Right.
which
Right.
comes with its own homoerotic overtones, but certainly different.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was such an interesting part of watching her watching Anshul watch Hadass, but also, and be singing about being a woman like her, but also watching her with such
Right.
longing and with jealousy and with, desire. And it is a very interesting kind of layers there.
Yeah, she Yentl as Anshul is literally listing, the performative acts that Hadass is doing to consolidate this image of the perfect bride. And, it is a performance, and yet she's also able to then move to a space of best friendship in this marriage, which, I do feel badly for Hadass at some point. She's now had this emotional attachment to Anshul in this way and thinks it means that she's having basically a liberated marriage. And then, she has to go back to like reading at night and toggle between that.
Right. Right. And we don't even know whether she continues to learn, right?
Mhm.
Anshul says you should, and yet we don't know once Hadass ends up with Avigdor whether that actually gets carried out or whether they kind of return to their more traditional roles. But you do see Anshul sort of teaching Hadass to let go of some of that performativity. You don't have to do these things for me. You can be something else. You can do these other, a wife doesn't have to be that, right? She's sort of
Right.
unpacking some of that, even as in some ways I felt like as Anshul is watching Hadass, Yentl as Anshul is kind of like trying to learn, right? Like I think Yentl always
Mhm.
felt like she didn't know how to be a woman. And so she's in some
Right.
ways watching like, could I be this? Could I learn this? Could I take this role on? Could I ever fill this role in Avigdor's eyes?
Right. And let alone, oh, do I want to? Right. But it's such a binary, it's such a dyad, and it's so clearly defined. I mean, she would quite literally have to be someone else as Yentl, as Anshul, or as a combination. Nonetheless, she would just have to be somebody else.
Right.
She wasn't accessing that in either zone. She basically is a woman who wanted to read a goddamn book. Like the Virginia Woolf, you either have the time or the money. She wanted the time. She wanted to read. Um, yeah, she never wanted to make the fish perfectly.
Right. And
Yeah.
kind of look down on that in some way. Although Hadass, I think, helps her appreciate that and the work that goes
Mhm.
into that in a different way.
Yes. And, her picking up the china, like, sort of despite herself, right? Like, she clearly didn't grow up with that. She didn't know from that, but was like, "Ooh, what's this?" And
Right.
kind of those more feminine coded delights, that she could actually start to appreciate, but interestingly, only as a man.
Right. Exactly. Um,
Mhm.
Helene Myers is pointing out in the chat that we should have in mind also the context of what was happening in terms of Jewish feminism at the time that this was coming out in 1983, which was a big
Yes.
movement um, of kind of flourishing of American Jewish feminism, the publication of Susanna Heschel's On Being a Jewish Feminist and Drisha Institute getting started as a space for kind of Orthodox Torah, yeshiva Torah learning for women. And Streisand may or may not have known about those things, but she certainly was carrying out a kind of second wave feminist view there. And whether, Singer also was very clear that he did not intend the story to have feminist undertones, but Streisand clearly disagreed. And whatever
Mhm.
either of them wanted, Yentl has become a kind of iconic symbol of feminist struggle against gender bias. What's interesting, I think, part of what's interesting about that is the ways in which some of, that Streisand had to make the story sort of tone down, I think, some of the queer coded aspects or turn down the volume on it a little bit in order to make it this kind of second wave power story of a woman who forges out to get what she wants and to, you know, gain her right to study Torah. And I think, you know, a lot of articles I've read about the film are sort of critical of that in some ways, although I think we also have to remember that, like, for that time period, for the story not to end with marriage, right, that it like it rejects the marriage plot, and also that she is unwilling to, you know, that it's a happier ending maybe than the story, but she loses Avigdor, and she insists on, you know, when he says, when they're having that argument in the room where after Yentl has shared the secret with Avigdor, and he says, you know, well, we can get married, and what more would you want? And she just looks at him and says, more, you know, right. And that kind of speaks all of it. Someone else was mentioning the question of the singing, and that Mandy Patinkin was upset that he didn't get to sing, and that also is not a small thing. I mean, in some ways, it's made fun of as this kind of like ego thing that Streisand literally sings every single one of the songs. No one else sings in the entire, like, can you even call it a musical if only one character is the one who sings? The songs operate kind of as, you know, her internal monologue. So I actually found that worked in some ways, but it also is a bold statement of just like owning the voice there, right? Like she does that like no one else.
Yeah, I mean, she centered herself in every way, but she also had to create it all. And I can imagine her feeling like, you're going to make me do it all myself, then I'm going to do it all myself. Right. Like that is a tale also as old as time. And so, and maybe that's part of the ending as well. I don't know. Like, okay, fine, then I'm going to go. You know, I was trying to think of, well, what are some alternate endings? You know, I was playing the choose your own adventure book game, and it's like, well, were they going to wind up in a throuple? You know, they were not going to, I mean, it was not going to break down every norm. You know, how were they going to still be in the same place, right? There's this huge unrequited love, I would say, in all directions in different ways. And so without her leaving, although she certainly, yes, could have gone to a nearby town, I'm not sure what the other empowered endings for Yentl might have been.
Right.
In that moment, in that time and place, navigating and negotiating that.
We have a comment also about Singer's sister, who was also a writer, Esther Singer Kreitman. Singer also had a great grandmother who was supposedly quite learned and rejected a lot of the traditional gender roles of the time. His mother also was scholarly. So he certainly had within his own family models of women who didn't fit the traditional gender roles and who flouted them and insisted on a kind of intellectual access and life that was not typical for women at the time. And I think that is really important, you know, that this wasn't imaginary necessarily for him, that there was an experiential basis for creating that fictional story of Anshul and Yentl, of Yentl the yeshiva boy, right? Which, and again, that's another interesting play in the Yiddish, right? It's the title of the story is Yentl the yeshiva boy. So I think it is really, thank you for bringing that up in the chat, that is a really important piece to name also, that of course, and we always have to say this, and you said this too, Sasha, that, you know, for all the ways in which this is about these categories that seem impervious or whatever, there always have been people who lived outside of these categories and who transgressed them. And so that the rigidity of those categories is in fact because of the fact that they are to some degree permeable, often with very, very high stakes, but it's not made up, right? It's not imaginary, it's not fictional, it's not something that has no basis in lived experience.
Yes, and to know the performances, well, I said I wasn't going to talk about the Holocaust, but here we are. Performances both in and out of camps, performances of cross-gendering, both for entertainment and in some ways for emotional survival. I mean, we have a lot of history of Jews playing and surviving with this both physically and intellectually. It is interesting to know that about his own family, that he had those relationships around him and probably could just extrapolate some of the tension on that.
Mm-hmm. And even within the text, there's, proof texts from the Talmud, from Torah, of all the things that are kind of the fears within this, right? So we have references to Avigdor and Anshel as being like David and Jonathan. There are references to other women in the Talmud who were learned, as being kind of models of this. So again, just kind of trying to even in noting the strangeness of these figures, to also like name their forebears, like their ancestral roots in some way.
Yes. Anytime something is forbidden, it's only been forbidden, and I'm using that word really loosely because it's already happened, right?
Right.
You can't write a law against something if it doesn't exist.
Right.
People try to write laws against actions and people to stop them from existing, but to deter them from existing. But if it's written, it's already happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I noticed at the very, very end, which I thought struck me as strange, and I'm curious if other people have thoughts about this, and maybe this is just, biographical, ultimately in its roots, but the film, Streisand dedicates the film to my father and all our fathers, which I thought was a very interesting choice. Which was a very interesting choice, right? And I know that Streisand's father died when she was very young, and she was drawn to this story in part because it is about, an exceptional father who trains his daughter, or recognizes his daughter as being, something other than what she's expected to be. And there's also a story about how in the many, many years it took her to get this film made, when it seemed like it wasn't going to be made, she went to her father's grave and saw that the grave next to his grave was of a man named Anshel. And so she took that as a sign that this was bashert and was intended to be. But it also felt to me like, well, if this whole story is about, what is possible for women potentially, and in part, right? And how do we open up these categories and understand gender roles in a different way, and understand gender identity in a different way? Can we think about who our models are that we need to thank for that, right? So I thought that was interesting. I don't know if other people, I also, as some of you who have been on JWA talks know, I often think about how the interesting historical dynamic of women who are boundary breakers, who are the daughters of fathers who did not have sons, right? And so what happens when a father doesn't have sons? He, in some cases, raises his daughters the way he would have his sons, and that opens up certain kinds of possibilities. So I believe that is a very powerful narrative historically and, personally for people. So that's not at all to take away power from that, but there was a way in which it just kind of like, you arrive at the end of the movie and I was like, interesting.
And her depiction in the movie of her father, to know that Streisand's father died young actually is that so aligns with how he's depicted in the movie, which is this kind, caring, but very one-dimensional, very young-hearted place, right? We don't see him in any other light. He's not given any other dimension, and that's all we see. And perhaps that's the best of, and what she could do personally in terms of a love letter, but it's true. The movie does not pass the Bechdel test. And
Right.
so this question of, Jewish women raising their daughters in a liberated, informed way doesn't even enter the picture.
Mm-hmm.
We not only don't have a Jewish mother for Yentl to look toward, right? But we just don't see that. And the only other woman we see, Hadassah's mother, is basically just shoving her off.
Right.
In the best way she knows how, but it is not you could do better than this guy who, we don't even know where he's from.
Right. And as Rebecca just pointed out in the chat, also, as we've said, there is a lot of misogyny in the depiction of women and women's roles. And there's a sense that Yentl stands out because she is serious and she is intellectually minded. And of course, there is a sense that like she cultivates that in Hadass, right? And so Hadass, who seems possibly a little bit flighty at the beginning, you come to realize that she is smart and thoughtful and can engage in Torah study as well. But it's still valuing Torah study as the only thing that makes you kind of worthwhile, right? There's no sense that there could be other roles or other kinds of smartness or strategicness. It's very much a single-minded view of what is valued and worthy and respected.
Right. All aligned with the masculine.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe a version that would be made today would be, I'm sure a version made today would be very different in many ways, but that might be one of the ways that would imagine a little bit more of a character for Hadass.
And, a feminist perspective on the male characters in the movie as well, who, are, as we can see by Avigdor, bursting at their own seams in different ways in terms of feeling constricted.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But can only express that by frolicking at in the river.
Yeah.
Throwing each other in the water is their one outlet.
That's right.
For all of that. Well, if there are any final questions, you can put them in the chat. But this has been really great. There's so much to delve into here. And I also wish that I knew more about the original play and the remakes that have really played around with the gender pieces of this story as well. So maybe we'll have a follow-up on that.
Maybe we can have like a JWA tour of all the shows.
Exactly. But I want to thank you so much, Sasha, for kicking off this series with a great conversation and giving us so many frameworks for thinking about the questions here and more depth to this iconic story and figure. As always, there is more to explore at JWA, including encyclopedia articles on Barbra Streisand and on Jewish women in the film industry. There is just so much to talk about in terms of that you can find on our site on gender and gender roles. If you're a Barbra fan, you'll also find more information on her other films, which there's lots to talk about. We had many difficult conversations in the JWA office about which film we should even choose from her work. We probably could have done a whole Barbra Streisand Film Festival and had a lot to talk about. We also want to point you to a resource guide for teaching both the story and the film from our friends at the Yiddish Book Center and their Teaching Great Books program. And I hope you will all join us next week, same time, same place, for a discussion of a very different film, although it also has to do with deception and identity. It's a documentary called Little White Lie by Lacey Schwartz about discovering as a young adult that she was Black, not the daughter of the father who raised her, but the product of an affair. And Lacey will be with us to discuss her story and the making of the film, and you can watch it for free on Amazon Prime if you are a subscriber, or for rent, you can rent it on Google Play, Apple TV, and YouTube. So lots of ways to see that, and then to join us for a conversation that leaps us ahead many, many decades, but will carry some of these questions forward. So thank you again, all of you, for being with us. And thank you, Dr. Goldberg. Always wonderful to learn from you and be in conversation with you. And until next time, be well and good night, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. See you again.
Take care.